Beautiful. Wonderful. I'm super excited to be here. So I'm going to do a quick intro of Irrational Labs, and then my goal for the presentation is to get you guys excited about behavioral economics and kind of using it as a toolkit in the product manager toolkit. So you have a lot of hard problems in front of you, and I think behavioral economics can be a shortcut for you in many ways. And so I'll talk about a few of our processes that we use to drive product development. By way of background, I actually was a product manager for 5 years at Intuit, and then have been working with Dan Ariely and I started Irrational Labs around 10 years ago, really with the idea of bringing behavioral science insights into the world of companies and organizations. We say like kind of bringing it into their DNA. There's a treasure trove of research out there about the psychology of what people do or why they don't do it. And the opportunity is to really understand it. And then we have a process. Behavioral science is just a process to apply it to come up with insights to drive product success. So here's my social proof slide, because we have to call it out if we're going to give you a bias. We've worked with a lot of the top companies. We train people. We do experiments. And I'm actually excited. I was here for the intros and excited that there are a lot of financial companies here, whether it be fintechs or banks. A lot of our work is around financial health and well-being. So I'll give you guys some examples about that. And we've worked with, large companies, the Facebook, Apple, Lyft, Uber, and then a lot of small startups as well, really basically teaching them the process of behavioral science and then building it into their product. So it's hard, just as by way of, I'm sure you guys have done the Zoom stuff, it's hard for me to quickly respond to the chat stuff. So I'm going to continue on, and then I'll pause at different times and maybe like check the chat to make sure that I'm not missing anything. But just note that we'll have time for that at the end to do lots of questions, I'm sure. So basically the field of behavioral economics is relatively new, right? It really grew from the field of economics, which is a study of the supply and demand. Behavioral economics is a study of what people actually do. And it studies our rationalities as humans and how we respond to the environment of decision making. So if I had M&Ms by me, it matters if they're close to me or farther away from me. Sure, I may like M&Ms, but I'll probably take them more if they're closer to me. And so understanding the environment of decision making is critical for understanding people's actual decisions. And that's really the proposal here, is that as you're a PM, you're studying the decisions of your customers. And I really want to turn people into behavioral PMs that much more appreciate the science of decision making and study the environment of decision making as more of a clue to predict what people will actually do. Not to say that we can't study attitudes and beliefs, but just like behavioral economics does, a behavioral PM gives much more emphasis to the environment of decision making and the small things that will drive us to do or not do something. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite charts in social science. So this is a chart of percent of employees who are saving for retirement. And on the left, you see close to 50% of employees are saving for retirement in some companies. And in other types of companies, over 90% of employees are saving for retirement. The very big difference between this, if you were to get this on your desk as a PM, let's say you got this report, you'd look at this and you'd say, what is driving those differences, right? The people on the left are going to be stuck in their cubicles well into their 70s, and the people on the right, they're going to be sipping mimosas just in retirement, having a day of it. And so you'd question, what is the difference? And typically as a PM, you'd probably kick off some qualitative research. You'd try to investigate, you'd ask people what the heck is going on. And maybe you'd say like, why are you saving or not saving for retirement? And so Irrational Labs, we did this, we asked over 1,000 people this question, why are you saving or not saving for retirement? And here are the types of answers that we got. For the people who were saving, they were great, right? They just like envision the future, kind of like how you think about retirement, whether you're on the beach or you're like sitting on a porch, you're watching your grandkids play. 86% of them said something about the future. I'm saving because I care about my grandkids. I'm saving because I care about being healthy. I really want something to fall back on in the future. For those of you, or for those of people who weren't saving, super logical, intuitive answers as well, right? I think the answers here were they were offended that we would ask them this question, because how could you save for retirement in a world where I can't even pay my bills, right? Like the idea of retirement savings was just terrible to them, and not terrible, it's just like not feasible, right? It just didn't make sense. And so we get these really strong answers from folks, logical, intuitive answers. And you probably, if you know behavioral science, you probably know the punchline to this is like, why are people actually saving or not saving for retirement? It's because saving is the default. For the people on the right, they were automatically enrolled into retirement savings. They didn't have to do anything, and they start saving. The people on the left, same story, right? They don't do anything, but they don't start saving. And so this is kind of, one of the classic examples of behavioral science. It's a default. But the point is not necessarily the default here. That's kind of that we'll get to defaults later. The point is when we're asking people to explain themselves, can we trust what they're telling us? And as a PM, this is kind of the tool that you have in your toolkit, right? We do customer interviews, we talk to people, we really relay the product requirements within the customer voice. And so it's fairly disappointing if we can't actually make that correlation successfully. And the real punchline here is that when we ask people, only a little over 6% of people are actually, we could say, telling the truth, right? Of telling us the actual reason or what's going on when they're saving for retirement. I like to say it another way of like 4% of people are not aware of their behavior. They're not really aware of the forces that drive them. We don't want to say that they're lying, but they're just not acutely aware of what actually is driving their behavior. And this makes your job incredibly difficult because you're asking people questions and they're not necessarily answering in the actual things that are causing their behavior. The more disappointing thing is that we asked the question in a multitude of ways. And so, as you know, the way you ask the question changes the answer. And so we're like, let's just try a few different classic ways to ask this question. When we asked in an open-ended way, which is basically, why are you saving for retirement? Pause is what we typically do in interviews. Not zero, but close to zero mentioned anything close to kind of automatic enrollment, retirement, or new hire. When we asked it and there was a choice, so it was a multiple choice with the choice built in, we had 12% of people answer the right answer. And so this generally gives us the clues that when we're asking people why something, we're actually pretty unaware of the real reason that's driving our behavior. And I totally understand that this goes against kind of the 5 whys that we were probably taught as a PM, of like, you ask why 5 times and you get to the core motivation of why somebody's doing something. Behavioral science throws that out the window. And we say, actually, we're not really aware of why we're doing something. We basically have the idea, we want people to say, like, I thought about this deeply, and the reason I'm doing this is because and fill in the blank. We can't really imagine a world by which people would sit down with us and say something like, I'm too lazy to uncheck a box. Like, in what world would a customer interview end in that sentence? Or I just did what other people are doing, right? I paid attention to the social norm, and that's why I picked this option. Or actually, more reasonably, what we actually want people to say, which is more representative of the truth, is like, I have no idea. Like, I have no idea why I actually did the thing that I did, because this kind of more represents reality, right? Like, if I were to take M&Ms or not take M&Ms, I'm not actually thinking about the reason I'm taking them is because they're closer or not. That processing doesn't go on in my brain. And so the real reason of why you did something, we say, I actually don't know the correlative reason of why I'm doing something or not doing something. But sadly, that's not actually, what we can say personally or our customers. And so the saving grace here would be as if customers or people, when we asked over 1,000 people this question, and by the way, we did it for a variety of questions, not just retirement savings, if people were actually not confident, right, in their answers, because you could say if they're not confident, then like, this is an interesting question, but it just doesn't matter. We asked people to rate how confident they were in their answers, and 70% were very to completely confident in their answer. So not only are they just wildly incorrect about the reason of why they're doing something, but what's making your job even harder is that they're pretty confident in it. And so it's difficult to listen to somebody say something and then have to discount it so much when they're that confident in their response. I'm going to share two, like this seminal study. This was from the 40s, but it's such a compelling one that is done by Peter Johansson, and he basically showed a variety of participants two faces. There are two female faces, and he said, which one do you find more attractive? It's probably not something an IRB or an academic board of approvals would do now, but he said, which one do you find more attractive? And then the participant would say, great, I know which one. And let's say they say, I find the white-haired woman more attractive. And the researcher assistant would say, that's wonderful, thank you very much. And a little bit by sleight of hand, you can kind of think by David Copperfield, he would say, wonderful, and can you please tell me why you think this person is so attractive? And what happened is that the participant in kind of a David Copperfield moment didn't really see that when he said, here are two pictures, put them down, great, show this one, didn't really see that he'd switched it. So you'd expect the participant to say, excuse me, I didn't pick that person. But instead, a majority go on to explain why they picked this person. A majority go on to just give really detailed explanations about why that person is the one that they picked. And this doesn't necessarily say that people are, there's some of this is experimenter bias, is I'm a part of an experiment, and so you're just trying to please the experimenter. And a lot of this is attention bias, where we're not actually paying attention to the person in general. And so you're asked a question and you're going to just answer the question. But what I actually think it is in a majority of ways is we're actually just pretty creative, right? So when you're asked a question, you're not going to say, I don't know. You're not going to say it's because everybody else is doing it. You're going to be pretty creative and make up a response. Jonathan Haidt calls this the press secretary problem. Because you can imagine as a press secretary, and this is actually way before our current political environment, so this is not a commentary on anything political going on now, but you can imagine that as a press secretary globally, your job is to get up in front of people and explain the actions of the political leader that you're representing. Doesn't matter what those actions are, you are supposed to explain them. And so I think that's how, as a behavioral PM, we should think about customers as a press secretary for themselves. Now, many of the times the answers they give will be completely correct. The problem is we just don't know when they're actually correct or when they're not correct. And that actually, as a press secretary, you're answering and you're giving really reasonable explanations for your behavior, but they may not actually correlate to the truth. And so I think that's kind of takeaway number one for behavioral economics, is that the say-do ratio between people is just not as ideal, or it's not as accurate as we kind of give it credit for. It's a nice little thing. Behavioral science really, it studies the gap between what people say they are going to do and what they actually do. And this is kind of all of us, right? We can say something, but in reality, we may actually do something very different. And again, it's not because we're bad people. This is not a commentary on the human system. A lot of our heuristics are great. They're shortcuts that we make in order to make better decisions. So you can imagine if every time that you had to spend $3, the correct way to spend $3 is to think about the opportunity cost of all the ways you could spend $3. So you go to a cup of coffee, you put $3 down, and you should have really contemplated what other coffee shops would give me better coffee. You should have contemplated, should I be spending that later in the day, maybe for lunch or dinner? You should be contemplating, like, should I be spending that in retirement? Is $3 better utility for me if spent in retirement? Obviously, this is just not something that any of us engage in on a daily basis. It's too tiring, and if we did, we'd be depleted, right? So we have these shortcuts and heuristics that we use in our whole life to basically make these decisions. But the reality is that the shortcuts and heuristics, like checking a default or being automatically enrolled, don't actually make it to the causal me, right? To the press secretary who's basically saying, I'm going to explain the actions of what I did. So there's this gap between not only what I say and what I do, but what I think. This is the reasons for what I did something. And so kind of one of the again, kind of just to hit this punchline a couple times, we believe as a field, basically the customer interviews, surveys, and focus groups can be misleading they are the easiest way to get insights. So I think there's always a trade-off, right? It's more difficult if actually sometimes it's not as difficult to read 10 academic papers as you would to say you have to do the 10 customer interviews, you have to recruit them, you have to pay them, you have to report on it. Like all these things are actually very, it takes a research team to do. And so in general, we thinking about what people do versus what they say. So now I'm going to go through two other principles, and I'll end it basically kind of what is our, all of this is going to be kind of what is our alternative to asking people questions. I'll pause right here, just check the chat to see if anyone has, okay. I don't think I'm going to be able to answer questions from there right now. So, so basically, I would propose that behavioral PMs kind of differ in two basic ways. One is how we think about measuring outcomes, in that we kind of add something to measuring outcomes. I'll get into that. And then the second is the design process. So how we come up with what is the intervention or what is the solution direction that we do. So I don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to go through these, and I'm obviously available for questions afterwards. So I'm just saying I'm not doing justice to the full process. Great. So for the desired outcome, most PMs that we've worked with, most general managers, most leaders, nail this one, right? So it's like, what are you trying to achieve? You got a profit goal, you have a revenue goal, or usually a revenue goal and a user goal, likely active users, likely retained users. You're kind of nailing the KPIs on outcome. The thing that behavioral economics adds, and I would suggest basically we are solely focused on, is what is the behavior that is required in order to get to the outcome? What is the behavior that needs to change in order for the outcome to change? And then we maniacally track that. And we get uncomfortably specific about the behavior. And so actually, this is one of the funnest exercises we do when we start consulting with a client, is we just ask them, what is the behavior you're trying to change? And you can kind of go around to each exec and ask them this question. And typically execs give very, very different answers. And even each person on the team will give very different answers. And that's because we kind of have these assumptions in our head about what the behavior is, but we really don't focus on it as the thing that we're driving to solve. And so you can imagine if you don't know as a team the behavior you're trying to change, it'd be very difficult for your customers to actually know the behavior you're trying to change. So I remember we did this once at YouTube with Dan and I. We asked the YouTube team kind of, can you talk about the behaviors you want to change? And people raised their hand, and they got in this negotiation and this debate. And you kind of say they actually are just not agreeing on the behavior that they're driving. And then at that time, you look at the YouTube homepage, and it was just a mess, right? It's trying to tell people to do everything from make a list to like videos to the top 10 popular to personalize for you. They just everything was on the YouTube homepage. It's not a surprise once you think about kind of the misalignment on the team. So here's a nice example of kind of how this could come alive and work for you. There's a question urban planners have to ask a lot, which is, how do you make roads safer, right? Driving is probably one of the more dangerous things that we do. I was actually contemplating today I'm going to drive somewhere. Is it safer for me to get on a plane or drive 20 hours? It's an interesting question because, driving 20 hours has a high incidence of accidents. Is it maybe actually safer for me to get on a plane? And so, driving kills 1.35 million annual deaths, 20 to 50 million people injured or disabled, and obviously financial impact from all of that as well. And so the traditional approach that urban planners have taken is this idea of less collisions, so less accidents. The desired outcome is to have less accidents on the road. Seems super reasonable. And the behavior that comes from that, so if you imagine you're a PM and you're like, great, we want to measure the number of accidents on the road, what are we going to design in order to drive that outcome? Say we want to help us so the cars can swerve. Because obviously if cars can swerve, they can avoid people. Cars are going really quickly. They want to avoid people. We don't want there to be any accidents or avoid other cars, right? So that's kind of the main design principle here. And so as a result, we basically have really wide roads because then cars can swerve. So if the roads were really narrow, it'd be hard for cars to swerve away from each other. and they're spacious and they're straight, because if they're curvy, again, it's hard for cars to get out of the way of other cars and hard for cars to get out of the way of other people. So makes sense. You want to reduce accidents, make roads pretty straight and spacious. We don't actually have the poll functionality, so I didn't plan ahead. So if we want to just maybe put in the chat what you think is correct. So did the road designers get the outcome, avoid collisions, and the key behavior right? So you can say A, the outcome is correct, B, the key behavior is correct, outcome and key behavior correct, or neither are correct. And if you just want to put that in the chat or think to yourself, if you put in the chat, you'll kind of have the great, validation of knowing that you're right, which is wonderful. I'll wait a minute. Okay. So I like, as PMs, I think you guys are probably honest with me, like, why is Kristen telling this story if both of them are correct, right? Something has to be wrong. Otherwise, she probably wouldn't be telling the story. So most of you guys are correct. The answer is D. In fact, doing this by some records is saying that the risk of death or injury goes up by a factor of 10 when roads are made straight and wide. So we're going to go into that. But the correct answer is D. Good job for those of you who said it. It actually increases death. Now, how does it happen? So roads are straight and wide. Great, enables more swerving. Check, that's what we're going for. And it enables fewer accidents. It's wonderful. What's going on? But it also increases speed. It increases speed for a few reasons. One, people feel safer, so they go faster. And two, urban planners increase the speeds on roads that are straight, right? And because it's like a highway, so you can increase the speed. Now, what happens when you increase speed? Deadlier collisions. So more people ended up dying and end up dying when roads are made this straight and narrow. Now, there's an alternative approach taken by Vision Zero in Sweden. And if you want to Google Vision Zero after this, there's lots of videos kind of describing this approach that are fun to watch. Their desired outcome was to avoid death and severe injury. So they said, yeah, that's interesting that accidents happen, but we don't really care about accidents. That's probably the insurance problem. We care about death, and we want to reduce that. And how would you reduce death? What is the key behavior you want to solve for? Cars slow down. Less people die when cars are going slower. How do we design our roads so that cars go slower? So I want to catch what they did here. One, they made sure that the behavior aligned with the outcome and that the outcome actually was the correct one. So I think in general, this is just a good, you're already good at outcomes, but you could imagine you have the debate between active use and retention and what are those outcomes. But really the behavior is going to be driven from the outcome. And you have to focus on what behavior you're trying to solve. I'll give you kind of an alternative example here. One is just weight. And so if you're a health tech company trying to reduce people's weight, the majority of people, if you were to ask them to say, like, how would you lose weight? It's about 50-50. That some say exercise, some say diet. Exercise is not the correct answer. There's a nice academic paper published and widely cited that says a bad diet, you cannot outrun a bad diet. So basically the fastest way to lose weight is diet. And this is not people's intuition. And so if you're a health tech company, you set a weight loss goal and you have the wrong key behavior, you're not going to get to the outcome of weight loss. And we could go through all of these examples in most domains by which setting a key behavior that aligns with the outcome is critical. So for this, you say, how do you get cars to slow down? That's an easy problem. You can make the roads narrower. You have physical barriers on the road so that cars have to slow down. And kind of the famous one is the roundabouts, where traffic is slowed at the key moments of intersections. And so in general, basically you have the outcome, you have the behavior, and you have the design that comes from the behavior. And the result here is it was a 90% reduction in fatalities through kind of doing these design principles that slowed people down. And so the main takeaway for us is basically, one, we are what we measure. And so we need to basically not only measure the outcome, we need to measure the behavior that we're trying to change. And again, for behavioral economics, it's all about the behavior. When we do workshops, we spend a third of the time we spend time on psychologies and we spend time on experimentation, but a full third on just figuring out what the behavior is that a company should focus on changing. And then, the other kind of vision zero philosophy is that the design matters. So people may want to be great drivers. If you were to survey drivers in both conditions, in like the highway condition and the roundabout condition, there's no change in how much they want to be good drivers. There's no change in the training of them. There's no change in the attitudes and preferences towards texting and driving. The change is the design of the system, right? The system is the one that things are going to make a user or customer do something more than necessarily a preference for being safe. And I think that's kind of a critical design principle as well. In fact, if you read the paper of Vision Zeros, the designers say it's our fault if people get into a crash. It's our fault because we just didn't design the roads well enough. And it's kind of a nice flip of the paradigm to say, just, if we didn't design the roads well enough, then our behavior that we're solving for needs to change. Okay. I'll move on. We have about 10 more minutes left of this, and then we'll go into 10 or 15 more minutes, and we'll go into Q&A. So one of the key things about behavioral economics is the behavior that you want to change. And then the second key thing that I think is different or is something for PMs to kind of consider integrating into their process is really how we come up with the intervention. And I'm sure you guys use some of these pieces, and nothing here is going to be revolutionary. But I think the kind of the process that we go through could be illuminating for teams. And so we call this process behavioral design. It's basically very simply the behavioral science. So basically studying human psychology of why we do what we do and don't do informs the design decision. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're not talking to customers, but what it means when we do talk to customers, again, if you remember from before, we're basically questioning our intuition or evaluating what people do versus what they say. And that's informing the design decisions. So the 3 steps to this, and then I'll give you 2 examples. The first step is a behavioral diagnosis. And this is a very detailed map of everything somebody does to get to a key behavior. So think about outlining every single step that somebody does in order to do the thing that you want them to do. So when we do this, we actually have teams usually start and they start and say, no, we have to get more detailed. So it's not about somebody, if you were to buy a cup of coffee, it's not about just saying, I'm walking by a coffee shop, I go in, I purchase, and I buy the cup of coffee. It's about saying, the night before I set my alarm, I wake up, I make my children breakfast, I get my keys, I forget something, I go back, I drive, I have to park, I have to wait in line, I'm talking to somebody, and then I have to figure out my order, then I have to order it. And so we think about all of those steps because every single step in there has a psychology that will increase the likelihood that I do the behavior or decrease the likelihood that I do the behavior. And so when we get to those detailed level of steps, the insights explode. We're not actually, there's nothing, too insightful about every step, but it's that they have to take the step and then the psychology that accompanies that step that can help us design an intervention that would increase the likelihood of doing the behavior. But I think the creativity of folks really explodes at this step. And then the second step is we identify the psychologies at play when people are making a decision. And this can be, information aversion, optimism bias, social norms, loss aversion, you name it. You probably know, generally, probably most of you know a lot of these biases. And we assume that basically at some level, every single step that somebody has, they're going to have something going on in their psychology, and let's identify it. And then we identify the psychologies most at play, and we do an experiment to either increase the likelihood of those, like amplifying those psychologies or removing them. And the experiment is basically just a controlled study that focuses on what people do versus what they say. So I'm going to give you 2 quick examples of what this looks like in the real world, both kind of fintechy examples for those of you guys out there in the financial services world. So the first one is around student loan debt. So kind of, as you know, actually, now that student loans have been paused for a minute, this is less of an issue. But student loan debt has been crushing Americans for a fairly long time. However, kind of crazily, there are 2 million students who were eligible for financial aid and did not apply for the financial aid. So think about that. People are eligible for free money from the government, and they otherwise would have to take on debt, and they just didn't apply to the to FAFSA. I can never pronounce it, so I try not to say it. To financial aid. And so what our team was asked by West Texas University, and we partnered with Admit Hub to basically think about this question of why do students apply or not apply for financial aid. So the normal kind of line of thinking here would be, well, let's just give information to students about if they qualify or not. Why don't we just give them information about the financial aid and then maybe they would apply? And so researchers at Harvard actually did this, where they just gave people information about their eligibility and measured if they increased application rate, and sadly it did not. And so the question that we did is, let's do the behavioral design process, right? And the first thing we did is said, well, what are all the steps you have to go through in order to apply for financial aid? And we mapped out all of the steps. You know, a behavioral diagnosis can sometimes look like this. It can sometimes look like, for us, we'll put a page on each slide, right? And you can have 100 or 150 page slide deck on all the steps it takes to have someone to do something. And it took over 20 steps where people had to like give their parents' tax forms in order to apply, so complex steps as well. And we narrowed in on the most relevant psychological bias affecting people at this stage, which was at the first step. And this was the decision to apply or not apply for financial aid. It was causing cognitive overload. Basically, you had to decide, do I apply or do I not apply? And in big decisions like that, what happens is that people procrastinate. It's great. It's a good decision to make. I'll just make it till tomorrow and we'll put it off. And so we narrowed in on this decision to say, how would we remove the decision deadlock that's coming from this decision? And so we basically added this was a, sorry, I'll go back. So we try to remove the decision deadlock here. And what we wanted to do is make it feel like it was just a part of the process. So we couldn't default people to all applying, right? That's illegal. We couldn't make them fill out the form. But we wanted them to feel as if it wasn't a decision that they had to make. It was just kind of a normal part of the process, a normal part of the flow. And actually in West Texas University, a majority of the students qualified, over 90% of students qualified. So it actually kind of almost was part of the flow for the majority of the students. So the text message said it's now a part of your fall enrollment process. The priority deadline for everyone is April 15th. And the other text message just said the priority deadline for everyone is April 15th. So we really didn't change much. This is a very light intervention. It's just a part of the enrollment process. And by doing this, the likelihood to apply on time increased by 3. So the odds of applying on time increased by 3. And if this was scaled to the US for the sophomores, because we actually did the intervention for sophomores who were going to juniors going to seniors, if this was scaled to that population, there'd be 230 more students that would likely qualify for financial aid. So again, just a very small text message change, but really based on understanding the psychology of what people are going through in order to drive the decision making. Okay, the second example is another financial services one of how do you increase deposits at a bank? So I'll be even more specific. I'm going in to cash my paycheck. People still have checks, they still cash them. I'm walking into the teller to cash my paycheck. Now, obviously in COVID, this may change. Probably has been a lot of help for I heard somebody who's on the digital team here. I'm sure they know that this has probably increased the likelihood that people use mobile deposits. But a lot of banks still have walking into the teller where you want to cash the check. How do you increase deposits? This is basically, what a bank's goal is to have more money in the bank, and you want them to put a little bit of it into their savings account. So think to yourself about how you would do this. What would you do in order to increase the likelihood that somebody who is going in to cash their full check would put a little bit more of it into the bank, would put a little bit more of it into savings? Not gonna ask you, but kind of I want you to reflect, think back, put your heels up, just like ponder to yourself. Wonderful. So what our team did was basically we did a behavioral diagnosis, which is where we started, and said, let's look at all the small steps that are required in order to make a deposit at a bank. And if you've gone into a bank recently, or maybe just remember a time when you've gone before, you have to fill out a deposit slip. So if you are going to cash a check at a bank, you have to fill out a form. Now, a form is very simple. It's nothing too hard, but you still have to fill out this form. And so by filling out the form, the question is, do people really not want to deposit anything at the bank, or do they just not want to fill out a form? Do they just not want to do anything? And so we call this a confounded problem, by which we can look at the data on what people do, which almost zero people were making a deposit at this bank. It was Latino Community Credit Union in North Carolina. Almost zero people were making a deposit at the bank. You could look at that and say, nobody wants to make a deposit. And then you'd probably go and talk to customers and say, what feature could we build in order to increase the likelihood that you would make a deposit? And you could imagine a bank coming up with things like a vacation calculator, or a cool savings wallet that you could put your money into. And because you'd brainstorm and say, obviously nobody wants to actually put their money in this bank, nobody wants to save. How would we design a feature that would increase the likelihood of people saving? And that's one approach. Where a behavioral scientist or behavioral PM starts is really thinking about all the small steps that go into a behavior and trying to understand if it's those steps that you could change or remove in order to drive the behavior. And so with the deposit slip, what would you do? You'd probably remove it. You'd say, let's decrease the friction and remove the deposit slip. This is actually not possible. We asked the bank, and they did not want to do this. I don't know if there's legal reasons across all retail financial institutions, but we could not get Latino Community Credit Union to do this. So we basically said, well, at least let's make it a fair fight, right? Let's make it a fair fight. And if somebody who wants to deposit something has to fill out a form, let's make everybody fill out a form so that they don't have the burden of having to fill out a form. Because you can imagine, actually, when you're filling out the form, it's not just the form. People are actually getting in line in front of you, right? You just see the line building up as you're filling out this form. And so we said everybody has to fill out a form. Now you can imagine, if you're a PM, you must have to deal with customer support, and you're like, that just would not fly. Like, of course there'd be customer support issues for people having to do something. And so we had to deal with the bank also saying this, and we said, it's an experiment, let's just try. And it this is a tangent a little bit, but kind of the hot tip that we give folks before we do an experiment is to say, that's wonderful, though may be people who complain. Why don't we set a goal or a number of people and say, if it exceeds this amount of complaints, we'll stop the experiment? Because what normally happens is you have a few complaints come in, people freak out, and they stop the experiment. And actually, a few complaints is actually completely normal. You change anything and people will increase the support calls for right after the launch. And so we have teams set a goal not a goal because we don't want to reach the goal, but a metric of how many they're willing to take before they turn off the experiment. We're glad we did that, because we got a couple of calls, but nothing that was like what the bank was actually worried about. And so the deposit slip was the main thing getting in people's way. We decided that we wanted to solve for the path of least resistance, which was mean if you take the path of least resistance, you're likely to save. And in the old world, filling out the deposit slip was not on the path of least resistance. So it's not that people don't want to save, it may be that they don't want to do anything. And so with this deposit slip, we basically had around 10% of people agree to but check the box on making a deposit. And they deposit around an average of $169, which, if you know the stats of kind of 40% of people have less than $400 in their savings accounts, $169 is an incredible lift. And 10%, I think when we initially saw that, we're like, wow, only 10%. But imagine you do any kind of feature, getting a 10% lift on something is actually pretty high, especially with the small tweaks to just filling out a form. I think if we were really doing this and not doing it for just an experiment, we would have made the form more compelling. We would have made the question more compelling. We would have told them about the benefits of saving. As you can see, it's just a checkbox to make the form look still pretty low key. So both of these examples are basically ones that suggest by articulating every single step somebody has to go through, assigning it to a psychology, and then prioritizing those psychologies and designing an experiment. By the way, experiments in PM language or just tech language or just A/B tests, they're just much more controlled in the way that we say we actually don't want to just say, I'm going to redesign a web page and put it against the thing I was doing before. That's an interesting test. It just doesn't tell us why something is happening. And the point of an experiment, as I'm talking about, is to kind of get to the core of like why something is happening so that you can then build a product strategy based on that why. So if we had just decided to kind of build a cool vacation calculator, we would have never figured out that we could actually make it, we could get a 10% lift from deposits just by changing the process by which people are making the deposits, right? And so when you figure out the why that something's happening, you can actually build your product strategy based on that. Okay, to summarize, the two things we talked about, one is the key behavior and the second is the process. And behavioral design is really kind of our process. To Rational Labs, this is something we talk about in 3 steps. Behavioral economics in general has kind of agreed that we use behavioral science to inform design decisions. For us, we have the specific steps of the diagnosis, the biases, and the experimentation to drive this. And I think with that, I will wrap up. The one plug I'll give, and we've just launched this given COVID times, is we have a boot camp that basically is designed for product managers, which goes over this process as well as all the psychologies that affect people as they're making decisions. I'm biased though, personally a big fan of it, as I think it's an online course, so you can go at your own pace and really digest all the learnings from behavioral science and apply it to your product. And then we did a code for you guys, so it's $50 off. And with that, I will pause. I'm going to stop, and I'll let discussion happen if folks want to chat about or ask questions about the talk. Or we can sit in silence.
Thanks, Kristen. There were a couple of notes that came in earlier, and let me see. One note is the code says SVMPA instead of SVPMA.
Oh yeah, I actually have a slight dyslexia, so that should be SVPMA.
Okay,
but but I will make sure before so the code will be your name. Actually, let me just change that right now.
You can see the detailed product engineers that are always double checking. People with a QA background, exactly.
Yeah, let me just change that right now so we can. Oops. Okay.
I know there were some comments about the road design. One of the questions I saw fly past involved how do you deal with subsegments of the population so that you've got folks that are maybe the majority of them slow down and drive safely, but you've got that 2% who either drive incredibly slow and back up traffic, or they drive incredibly unsafely and make it unsafe for everyone else. And how do you figure that into the behavior when you've got subsets that are affecting the overall population? And a couple of people chimed in that sounded a lot like the mask wearing problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I think mask wearing, kind of like driving, but let's just talk about mask wearing, is really a social norm question. And it's quite a nice one, right? So I recently was in Oregon, rural Oregon, and nobody was wearing masks. And I go into a grocery store and I'm wearing a mask. Nobody's wearing a mask. It feels really awkward to be that one person wearing a mask. Now, of course, you keep it on, but it feels awkward. So you can imagine that if you're a person in rural Oregon going to the grocery store, none of your friends are wearing masks, very difficult for you to. And so masks are an example of how much norms influence our behavior. It's an example by which if you were to ask somebody why they're wearing a mask, they would tell you because I care deeply about my grandmother, and I don't want her to get sick, and I don't want other people's grandmothers to get sick. And yet I would assume that the real reason that people are wearing or not wearing a mask has a lot to do with the norm by which their environment crafts for them, right? Again, you can think about eating healthy or not healthy, right? I go to the Midwest. I'm from the Midwest. Very difficult to order a salad with my family. They're just not people who order salads, and so the norm by which we're in will drive our behavior. And I think speed and stuff has the benefit of that as well, by which, yes, you're going to have people acting out of the norm, but if the norm is strong, whether it be you're going slow because it's a school, there's a sign, yes, but like the norm is that everybody else is going slow, that is going to have more power than and actually that's in seatbelts. One of the thing that the analysis of seatbelts is like, yes, you can have fines for seatbelts, but one of the things that have really driven seatbelts is the annoying beep that happens when you're sitting in the car. Why? Because the person in the passenger seat is just not going to tolerate a beep. They're just not going to allow you to keep your seatbelt off and have a beep in the car. And so I think a lot when we think about behavior change, there's a lot of forces at nature. Norms is definitely one of them to evaluate.
And is there any specific kind of strategies for separating out, like if you've got two different populations of customers that maybe have different norms, whether you've got a universal product that's shipping to two different kind of cultures from either geographically or within the same, any advice on kind of how to break that problem down or techniques out there?
Yeah. So I think, one of the things is to acknowledge that they're living in a norm. And so it's not going to be easy to design for two different cultures and two different norms, right? And so if you're making a healthy at-home delivery meal service, you're going to make it different for people in California than you are for my family in the Midwest. And so I think at some level, you have to make some hard decisions by understanding the norm that people are exposed to, or the environment of decision making that they're exposed to, and designing an intervention that works for them. And so that's kind of why at some level, you have to pick a large population, and you don't want to, like, having the niche populations becomes more difficult. I would say the other kind of uplifting fact on human behavior, and some people may think this is uplifting or not, is we usually think people have really strong preferences, like I like apples or I don't like apples. The reality is I like apples if they're cut up. And so it's on us as product designers to not necessarily take that, like, I like apples or I don't, and just say, at what point would you like apples? Could I put cinnamon on them? Could I cut them up? Are they by the fries and that's not why you're liking them? And so I think we take people's word on their strong preferences probably too much, instead of evaluating, maybe my product has to change the norm before I launch, but at some level, there are these nudges that you can do to change the environment of decision making that aren't going to get people to react, of like, I am the type of person who just won't do this.
Very good. So if people are interested and have some further questions, feel free to unmute your line and introduce yourself and a question. If you were worried about your audio, feel free to post it in the chat window. I'm happy to read that for you as well. See if we get any additional questions coming in here.
Hi, Kristen. This is Nitul. I'm a product manager at Walmart, and the example of behavioral PM for the road was pretty insightful in a way for my product. The question I have was, how do you balance the change in behavior for one desired outcome to not let it affect the other desired outcomes for that user? For example, given in your scenario, increasing bumps or reducing the speed of the car to reduce collisions, that's one desired outcome, but the other is to reduce the maintenance of the car. Slowing down would increase the maintenance. and also reaching the place on time. So those are also the desired outcomes of the user in product sense. So how do we balance those two out?
Yep. That's great. So I think so this is a little bit of an incentive problem. And cities have the incentive to keep people safe, and they may not have the incentive like an employer has to get you to work on time. And so the reason why a city would choose something like reducing deaths is because that is their incentive model. I think you hit on something that I worry about a lot. I think companies may have the most salient incentive in our world is active use, engagement, revenue, number of customers. We don't have the customer well-being as an incentive. And so you could imagine if you're a bank, you could say, I want to have people get more loans. Another customer well-being would be getting people to pay off the loans or increasing deposits. And so, I think there's a question of which outcome you're choosing, but in order to figure out the priority of your current outcomes, you'd look at the incentive system. And I think many companies would do well with changing some of the incentive system. So as I'm a PM, am I only measured on active use? It's going to be tough for me. You can kind of think about a classic Facebook example, right? If I'm only measured on having people kind of spend more time on Facebook, it's going to be tough for me to increase the overall well-being of my customers and maybe connecting with their friends and family in meaningful ways. Because you're actually not measured on meaningful connection, you're measured on time on Facebook. And so I think the discussion on prioritization of outcomes is a good one. And the one that you have currently prioritized is the incentive that your company or your organization is giving you. And the question is that incentive the best one for your customers? And at some level, you're going to have to make some prioritization call, but really it's an incentive question versus a prioritization call. I know that's not a straightforward answer for you. There's no like one strong answer, but I think it's a bigger issue of incentive management for us. And you guys are powerful people, right? You're designing the systems by which people live, they work, they succeed in life, whether it be the security systems that you're designing, or or I think someone was some child's food or child anyway. You're designing a lot of systems, and so the incentives that we have in our company will determine the outcomes that we choose, and that so go to the incentive level and measure yourself on customer well-being as well as active use.
So be careful what you measure.
Yeah, exactly. I'll tell a quick story. We were working at Lending Club, and I decided, it was early when I was working with Dan, I decided it'd be easier for me to sell a performance-based contract by which if I increase their conversion flow, they pay us. And if I don't, they don't. And it was really interesting. I became a predatory lender, I would call myself, right? Where the things I was suggesting were just totally outlandish. They were good, right? They would have worked. But they said in no world would legal approve that. But my incentive system was to increase conversion, right? It wasn't for customer well-being. Even though, I'm one of the most pro-social people, our company also is. And so the incentives that drive us drive our behaviors. By the way, we ended up, we had a measure of increasing it by 5 points. We ended up increasing it by 4 points. And so didn't get the payout there. But we also did not use anything manipulative. So I think we all won.
It's one of the hazards of working in a highly regulated industry. We also had a comment come in saying that another good example of kind of incentives misaligning with goals was some of the medical systems out there that are fee for service based. So they're incented to maximize the number of services that they're executing on, as opposed to like maximizing patient health, for example. So that's another interesting example of.
And I think that's a nice, some of the opioid epidemic could be kind of related to incentives as well. So there was a not just pharmaceutical sales and increasing, but basically the period of time where this skyrocketed, doctors measure themselves more on pain management. So that was kind of a big push, is to say the patient's pain matters the most and our responsibility is to decrease the pain. And so that is kind of how the narcotic got into widespread, as this became the incentive of the doctor. And it sounds great. It just, the incentive drives the behavior. And you say, if we want to reduce people's pain at all costs, let's just give them 80, 120, 300 milligrams a day. And so, yeah, incentives in the medical industry are obviously one of the top drivers.
Do you
I'll mention one. Oh.
No, please go ahead.
One study on opioids, which is actually quite nice, and two research institutions actually replicated each other in doing this. You say, how do you get doctors to decrease the amount of pills that they prescribe? And if you do the behavioral diagnosis, you basically look at every single step that somebody does before they are prescribing you the medication. And when you do this, you see that the medical software, kind of like Epic, it wasn't Epic, but medical software, that people are entering in actually has a default in it. And by default, I mean the small gray text that said, in one case, it said 30 pills. And so you had 40% of doctors prescribing 30 pills. Why are they prescribing 30? They're smart people. They can make their own decisions, but it was the easiest, was the path of least resistance. And so when the research team changed the default to be something like 12, you had a large drop in 30 and an increase in 12. And so, when we look at kind of the path of least resistance, or the full diagnosis, you can really understand, and you're looking at the path of least resistance, you can understand it's not about doctors not being bad people and prescribing more or less. It's not about convincing them to prescribe something different. It's really about kind of the steps that you're taking along the way to get you to the behavior.
Do you ever see like a compound goal where you build an equation with, say, two different factors? I know somebody was saying, like, if your goal was, profit only, then that can lead you to some very bad places. But if you had profit and, say, number of customers or something like that, whether there's a way to kind of embed that into an equation with two variables in it and then maximize for that.
I think you could. I think humans are simpler than that. So, it's what your manager says good job on. It's what the email that goes out to congratulate you and the company says. I think you could have an equation and you can be very technical about it. I think we underestimate how much emotion is in the decisions that we make, even if we can be extremely rational in the inputs. So I would be cautious. I would say, how do you reward people at the more emotional level on the incentives that you want to drive? And those could be two incentives, right? You could still have two incentives there. I just don't think the equation will get you all the way there from a culture perspective, by which the culture of the company will help drive what your designer's doing, what your researcher's doing. So I would focus more on the soft side of things. And obviously an equation is going to help prove your point that you've incentivized both things, but the soft elements is actually what's going to change your company.
Interesting. So I've got one final question from Mark was asking, are there any kind of overarching themes besides clearly kind of path of least resistance is one, but just what other, if you had a set of bullet points to put on a t-shirt, what would you have us all wearing tomorrow?
Yeah, actually, I just made a t-shirt, so I'll tell you the t-shirt that I made, and then I'll tell you the answer. I made a t-shirt that says, my favorite bias is a bias for action. It's just kind of a
there you go.
Words there. So I would say behavioral economics comes down to a few things. One is information does not change behavior. So if you tell me about eating better, if you tell me about how to save money, if you tell me about why your product is so good, the information is not going to close the intention action gap. And there's wild amounts of research across domains about how education or increasing literacy is just not enough to change behavior. What is, and we would say the environment of decision making is a higher coefficient on behavior change. That means if the M&Ms are closer to me or farther away. So the environment or the context of our decisions will have an outsized influence on our environment. The second is, or the third, which is what we've talked about, is that we are creatures that take the path of least resistance. And again, that doesn't mean we're lazy. It just means we take the path with the least friction, and that will drive the majority of our decision making. And then fourth, is present bias, which is we are creatures of the present moment. We overvalue today versus tomorrow. So a quick example, if you look at your Netflix queue, I'm sure that you have a lot of documentaries and classics in your Netflix queue. But if after this call you go and watch something, it may be a comedy, or maybe a more of what the researchers call lowbrow movie, right? We're really driven by the present moment, what rewards us today. For Rational Labs, we have a framework we call the 3Bs. It's kind of a nice reminder of like, get to the key behavior, reduce the barriers, and amplify the benefits. And by when we say benefits, we mean immediate benefits to somebody today. And most of the time, organizations don't forget that. We have a world that's trying to get us to spend more, get our attention, and you're competing with that world. So even if you're doing something really good for the world, and we hope you are, you're still competing in the world that's grabbing my attention. And so we need to kind of help people prioritize the things that they want to do in the long run, even though they're difficult for them to do in the short run. So I'd say those 4 principles are the ones that our team really focuses on. Obviously, the world of behavioral economics is extremely complex. And I think the more you get into it, the more you understand that human psychology is not like, tell me the answer to this. We're complex beings. But really, that's why it's a field of study by which we have not only the psychologies, but we have a process in order to understand how to drive change.
Excellent. Well, this has been fascinating. I've definitely enjoyed chatting and hearing everybody's questions and everything. Devashish, you wanted to chat a little bit. One is, first off, I'd really like to thank you for such a great presentation. This was very informative, and I know that we'll probably even get more folks on the YouTube channel once this goes up. It'll probably be a couple of weeks before we get it posted, but that should be that should show up there as well. We do. I want to give Devashish a quick moment here to introduce what we've got coming up next, and then if you've got any comments for Kristen that you'd like us to pass along, please put it in the chat window. And Devashish, if you can unmute, you can tell us what's coming for future talks.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks very much, Kristen. That was an excellent talk. And as you can see from the chat window, a lot of other people think so as well. And on behalf of SVPMA, we'd like to thank you very much for this excellent talk on behavioral design. And I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about upcoming events. For those who may have missed it, if you came in late, we have next month, Greg Grassi, CEO of Actuation Consulting. And he's going to talk about factors that drive improved performance on product teams. And this is based on some research that his company has done and a large survey. And these are the results from the survey that they have analyzed, and there's some key insights into product team performance. Then we will, over the next few months, we are trying to engage with certain other speakers, some of whom we have finalized with and some we are still in dialogue with. And one is Roger Granis, who is going to talk about how to get salespeople to promote and grow your product success. So this is the intersection of product and sales. And that should be an interesting talk as well. In addition to that, we're engaging with Teresa Lina, who has previously spoken at SVPMA a couple of years ago. And she's going to talk about market competition, how to own your competitive market. And we're also going to have Perry Clark, who is a lawyer. He's a partner in a law firm, and he's going to talk about intellectual property and patent litigation. And a lesser known part of products, which product managers typically have to only uh, deal with tangentially, but there are people in each of our companies who have to deal with intellectual property and copyright issues and other related factors that that affect a product market. So those are some of the upcoming events. As I had previously mentioned, we normally have our events on the first Wednesday of every month, except for months where the first week has a holiday, in which case we move it to the second weekend, second Wednesday of the month. But we will keep you all apprised of our upcoming events.
Yeah, and keep an eye on svpma.org, and our YouTube channel will have a copy of this of tonight's presentation, so you can refer back if you missed a screenshot or something. Check back in a couple of weeks on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to refer back to that. And then, or if you missed the SVPMA discount code for the class. Anyway, thanks once again to our guests and to all of our attendees. I hope this was useful. If you have any feedback at all, feel free to send it our way. You can address it to the board@svpma, or you can board@svpma.org. Or if you want to send it to me directly, you can send it to tom@svpma.org. Love to hear comments. If there's topics that you want to hear that are of interest, if you know some great speakers, don't hesitate to drop a line. We definitely welcome feedback. As good product managers, we're always looking for new features and ideas. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you again in August. So thanks everyone. We'll see you soon.